Hello, fellow book people. Hey, let's do a book review without even the book, because the book is going to be right here. I'm reviewing Astounding by Alec Nevala-Lee, 2018 book of nonfiction about Astounding. John W. Campbell, Isaac Asimov, Robert A. Heinlein, and Ron L. Hubbard, and the golden age of science fiction. A book that centers around John W. Campbell, who was the editor of the premier science fiction magazine of sort of the late 30s, 40s into the 50s. It was the number one. It was the top one. And John W. Campbell, as the editor, shaped science fiction, kind of the capable engineer man who was going to solve everything. Very much predictive science fiction. Someone like Isaac Asimov. He helped kind of form him. Kind of the Foundation series, one of his big series. That and the three laws of robotics were all stuff that he and Asimov together sort of seem to have come up with and worked with, at least, and Asimov has someone who has definitely acknowledged that. Someone like Robert A. Heinlein, known for A Stranger in Strangeland, Starship Troopers, his Juveniles, Podkane of Mars, Have Spaceship Will Travel, is another one of these premier voices in science fiction of the time. Came to him as much more of a kind of a fully formed fellow. Interestingly enough, like Asimov is very much more kind of a left-leaning fellow, where Heinlein was definitely much more right-leaning, up until kind of later stages, being very much kind of supporter of someone like Ronald Reagan and his security things and his security concerns, even though he was someone who was also very libertarian, an avid nudist, and had some very, very, very strange ideas that got more stranger, more unbridled. Sorry, I'm just freeing poor older dog from her leash that she is tied to. So yeah, and then you have someone like Ron L. Hubbard, who with Campbell, they together seem to have really kind of formed this idea of Dianetics, this science of the mind that was going to, get people clear and was going to unleash the powers of the mind, which turned into Scientology, which this kind of pseudoscience nonsense, as someone like Asimov and Heinlein definitely came to see it, was sort of the dark side of science fiction, of this imagination unbridled and kind of starting to fool yourself into believing you're made up crap, in a way. Also just the idea of science fiction as a predictive force, which I think is sort of nonsense. I think it's much more, Nevala-Lee definitely kind of portrays it as much more of this thing that was going to kind of get people, get young people into sciences, growing up as sort of a formative thing, as sort of a part of a kind of imaginative culture, but not as a predictive or as a that kind of force. I'm a lot more skeptical about that. It's one of these things about literature having concrete uses. It's like, no, I don't think that's the shape of literature, and science fiction is a literature. It's a really, really good book in that it focuses on these four guys, because actually I don't like any of these four guys. L. Ron Hubbard seems to have been basically just a con man, user, somebody who was just going from thing to thing, and you can take what that means. I mean, sometimes hucksters come up with religions, and the religions take on a life of their own, and Scientology definitely has its very much dark side, and as gets pejoratively labeled as a cult. But I mean, a lot of things start out with cults and develop from there. It's definitely something I would stay well clear of. But then you get someone like, Robert A. Heinlein, who was actually, he's somewhat the most closed character of the book. He's someone who was the most physically sort of separate from the rest of the people. He seemed to live off in his own bubble and was definitely a man of his own ideas, a man who was highly resistant to editing, and that obviously, if you know Robert A. Heinlein, as his books got bigger and weirder and more baggy and kind of shapeless as they went along, you could see that happen. There's also health issues, which is interesting to read about. Some book like See No, Have No Evil, or I can't remember the name of the book, but it was just like, wow, that's a mess of a book. And it's like, yes, he was in a mess of a medical situation at that point, and that really showed in that book. But John W. Campbell, him and Ron L. Hubbard getting together for Dianetics, it's just like, it was good to have short chapters on that stuff, because I felt kind of ill almost reading about it in a way, just because it was such this, just like kind of the worst kind of of Freudianism, of just sort of an inward turning kind of twisty. It's like, it's unhealthy. It feels like unhealthy thought to me. It feels like just eating its own tail, eating its own crap in a way, is the best way I can describe that. And Campbell himself was a man of, someone who rejected Samuel L. Delany, probably one of the great science fiction writers, a black man, a gay black man, rejected like one of his books, saying, well, oh, you've got a black protagonist, and my readers aren't going to sympathize with that. A black guy is the protagonist, which, and I think he became steadily worse in that department as he got older. But it shows that kind of an ugly side of things, and also that Campbell was only interested in his own ideas, and if you weren't going to peddle his ideas, someone like Ray Bradbury had to develop independently, and someone like one of the other big three, Arthur C. Clarke, was probably protected from a lot of the Campbell influence just because he was a Brit over in England. So it's one of these things that makes you grateful that there are so many different venues for thought nowadays, and we're not kind of a single monolith, even if this was a golden age of science fiction, so-called golden age of science fiction. It's one of these books. It's tough because someone like Asimov and Heinlein were sort of, I don't know if they're heroes, but they were the science fiction authors that I read as I grew up. So it was a sobering thing this book was like written for me, I feel like, because it was like, oh, I'm going to finally learn about kind of science fiction this further on, a kind of I don't know if it's revisionist science fiction, but something that kind of pulls back and kind of just talks about these guys in a frank way. And unfortunately, when you start talking about them in a frank way, you start to hear a lot of things that aren't that great. Isaac Asimov, who I agree with, Steve Donahue talked about this book. Always check out his site. Was talking about how Isaac Asimov is really kind of, he steals this book. He is the most likable. He is the most open, most probably palatable in a kind of his to me of politically, but he's also a serial harasser of women. I mean, when you get a guy that women in an office hear that he's coming to the office and they leave, that shows you that this is a serial harasser, and with all his good aspects to him and his kind of openness and charmingness, he was also a harasser of women. And it's kudos to Alec Nevala-Lee to not sugarcoat that, to give us a full round picture of him, to not like just say, okay, well, we're going to banish him to the outer rim as well, but just to incorporate that in, that this is a guy who harassed women, So, and I mean, it gets into the culture of the world of this time, but it's also saying that Asimov was notable in his harassment. That this is a dude that women would actively avoid. So yeah, it's a really good book. I really loved how it was all for men. I read this really quickly. As it's funny, I'm struggling through a kind of history of Italy at the moment, and I'm kind of plugging my way through, and it's very interesting. But it's like, it's hard for me to get through it. It's almost like I respond to portraiture a lot more than I respond to landscape. Landscape doesn't engage me, and in some ways, like this history of Italy I'm reading at the moment, that's like a landscape. Whereas this book, which is like all these like vivid portraits of these four men who shaped a lot of what I would consider my teen reading, is a very vivid portraits of these often unlikable, kind of gnarly fellows who shaped a lot of my worldviews, and it was really great to read this book, kind of giving a kind of an assessment of them, and making me even with that wanting to go back to their books. Someone like Asimov is very much kind of a workman-like writer, but even his books I want to kind of go back to and read them. Asimov, interestingly, Asimov, a serial harasser of women who is notable for not actually having women in his book. And I don't know if that's because of some sort of fundamental lack of respect for women. Though one of his most famous stories, the robot stories, has a female scientist at the center of it. Yeah, all the interesting contradictions of real life, which are always fascinating to hear. So yes, that's my outdoor review of Astounding. More videos later.